The story behind Troy began long before cameras rolled in 2003. Like the ancient legends that inspired it, the film itself was the result of decades of fascination with one of history's most enduring tales. Rather than adapting a single novel, Troy drew inspiration primarily from Homer's epic poem, the Iliad, one of the oldest surviving works of Western literature. Written around the 8th century BCE, the Iliad recounts only a brief period during the final year of the Trojan War, focusing less on the war itself and more on the rage of Achilles and the complex relationships between warriors, kings, and gods. Over the centuries, however, countless writers, playwrights, historians, and filmmakers expanded upon Homer's work, transforming the Trojan War into one of mythology's most recognizable stories. Hollywood had visited the Trojan War before, but usually with modest budgets or theatrical storytelling styles that reflected the filmmaking techniques of their respective eras. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, however, advances in visual effects made it possible to recreate vast ancient cities, enormous armies, and spectacular battles on a scale that had previously been impossible. At the same time, historical epics were beginning to regain popularity after years of relative absence from major studios. Films such as Gladiator demonstrated that audiences were once again interested in grand historical adventures filled with political intrigue, warfare, and larger-than-life heroes. The commercial and critical success of Gladiator convinced studio executives that there was room for more ambitious epics aimed at adult audiences. Warner Brothers recognized this opportunity and began exploring legendary stories that could receive the same large-scale cinematic treatment. Among the many possibilities, the Trojan War stood out because it combined romance, tragedy, action, political conflict, and iconic characters whose names had remained famous for thousands of years. Achilles, Hector, Paris, Helen, Agamemnon, Priam, and Odysseus all possessed dramatic potential that could appeal both to audiences familiar with Greek mythology and to viewers encountering these characters for the first time. Developing the screenplay, however, presented an enormous challenge. Homer's Iliad is not structured like a conventional modern film. It contains lengthy speeches, extensive descriptions of warfare, poetic language, supernatural interventions, and numerous subplots involving dozens of warriors. More importantly, the Iliad actually ends before the famous Trojan Horse enters the city. The death of Achilles, the fall of Troy, and the conclusion of the war were described in later myths rather than in Homer's original poem. If the filmmakers adapted only the Iliad, audiences would likely expect an ending that never arrived. If they adapted the entire Trojan War mythology, they would have to combine material from many different ancient sources into one coherent screenplay. To solve this problem, screenwriter David Benioff was hired to develop a script that would unify these various legends into a single cinematic narrative. At the time, Benioff was still relatively early in his screenwriting career, although he had already demonstrated an ability to write emotionally driven stories centered on morally complicated characters. Rather than producing a literal adaptation of Homer, Benioff approached the material as historical drama inspired by myth. One of his earliest and most significant creative decisions was removing nearly all of the supernatural elements. In Greek mythology, the Trojan War is heavily influenced by the Olympian gods. Zeus, Athena, Apollo, Hera, Aphrodite, Poseidon, and Ares constantly interfere in battles, rescue heroes, manipulate events, and decide the outcomes of conflicts. Achilles himself is the son of the sea goddess Thetis, making him partially divine. Throughout the Iliad, divine intervention is not merely background mythology. It actively drives the story. Benioff believed that a modern audience would connect more strongly with a grounded version of these events. Instead of portraying literal gods walking among humans, the screenplay presents religion as something the characters sincerely believe and while leaving all supernatural events open to interpretation. This transformed Troy from a mythological fantasy into what resembles a historical war drama. Characters still pray to the gods, interpret omens, and seek divine guidance, but victories and defeats result from human decisions rather than miraculous interventions. This approach fundamentally changed the tone of the story. Achilles is no longer an invincible demigod protected by magical destiny. Instead, he becomes an extraordinarily gifted but fully human warrior whose legendary reputation comes from unmatched skill, fearlessness, and relentless ambition. Likewise, Hector's nobility, Paris's impulsiveness, Agamemnon's greed, and Priam's wisdom emerge through human choices rather than divine manipulation. Another major challenge involved condensing an enormous cast of characters. Ancient Greek mythology includes hundreds of named participants in the Trojan War. Many appear only briefly but play important roles in individual episodes. Including all of them would have produced an unwieldy film lasting many hours. The screenplay therefore merged certain narrative functions, eliminated numerous secondary warriors, and concentrated on a relatively small group whose relationships could sustain the emotional core of the story. The writers also made structural changes to improve pacing. In mythology, the Trojan War lasts 10 years. Presenting an entire decade of conflict in a single film would have required constant time jumps that risked disrupting narrative momentum. Instead, Troy compresses much of the conflict into what appears to be a significantly shorter campaign. Although this sacrifices historical and mythological accuracy, it allows viewers to experience the war as a continuous escalation toward its inevitable conclusion. Studio executives supported this streamlined approach because it made the story more accessible to international audiences. They wanted viewers to understand the characters' motivations without requiring extensive knowledge of Greek mythology. As a result, many complicated genealogies, political alliances, and mythological backstories were simplified or omitted entirely. When Wolfgang Petersen accepted the challenge of directing Troy, he was stepping into territory that perfectly matched many of the strengths he had demonstrated throughout his career. Petersen had built a reputation for directing stories that combined large-scale spectacle with deeply personal human drama. Whether he was telling the story of a trapped submarine crew in Das Boot, the emotional fantasy of the never-ending story, the political tension of Air Force One, or the survival thriller The Perfect Storm, one consistent element appeared across his work. He was fascinated by ordinary and extraordinary people facing overwhelming circumstances. His films rarely treated spectacle as an end in itself. Instead, large events served as the backdrop for exploring courage, fear, ambition, sacrifice, loyalty, and the consequences of human choices. That philosophy became the foundation of Troy. Rather than creating a fantasy filled with magical creatures and divine intervention, Petersen wanted audiences to believe they were watching real people living through one of history's greatest wars. Although the Trojan War exists somewhere between mythology and history, his artistic goal was to remove much of its legendary distance and make it feel immediate, physical, and emotionally believable. Instead of asking viewers to admire ancient heroes as unreachable legends, he wanted them to understand these characters as flawed individuals making decisions that would ultimately shape history. One of Petersen's earliest creative priorities was realism. This did not necessarily mean historical accuracy in every costume, weapon, or architectural detail, but emotional realism. Every major decision in the film reflects this principle. Characters bleed, become exhausted, question themselves, grieve for loved ones, and wrestle with conflicting responsibilities. Even Achilles, arguably the greatest warrior in mythology, is presented not as an immortal champion, but as an exceptional human being whose greatest fear is not death itself, but being forgotten. This emphasis on mortality became one of Petersen's defining themes. Throughout Troy, nearly every important character thinks about legacy in one form or another. Achilles seeks eternal fame. Hector wants to protect his family and preserve his city. Agamemnon craves political dominance. Priam hopes future generations will remember Troy with honor. Paris pursues love despite its devastating consequences. Petersen viewed these motivations as timeless human concerns rather than exclusively ancient ones. In interviews surrounding the film's release, he frequently suggested that although the setting belonged to antiquity, the emotional conflicts belonged to every era. His visual philosophy also reflected this approach. Peterson wanted audiences to feel the weight, scale, and physical danger of ancient warfare. Battles were designed not simply as exciting action sequences, but as exhausting struggles filled with uncertainty and chaos. Soldiers collide with shields, swords become lodged in armor, horses panic amid confusion, and victories often come at terrible cost. Rather than presenting perfectly choreographed duels resembling elaborate dances, Peterson encouraged fight scenes that emphasized desperation alongside skill. The duel between Achilles and Boagrius near the beginning of the film illustrates this philosophy perfectly. The fight lasts only seconds. Instead of prolonged exchanges designed purely for entertainment, Achilles defeats his opponent with astonishing efficiency. Peterson deliberately avoids turning the moment into spectacle for its own sake. The brief encounter instantly communicates Achilles' unmatched ability while simultaneously reinforcing the brutal reality of combat, where superior skill often ends conflicts almost immediately. Peterson's experience directing military stories strongly influenced how he approached the Greek armies. In Das Boot, he had explored the psychological strain experienced by soldiers trapped together under impossible circumstances. While Troy takes place on a vastly larger scale, many similar ideas appear beneath its epic surface. Commanders argue over strategy. Rivalries emerge within the leadership. Political ambitions interfere with military objectives. Individual soldiers form close bonds while preparing for battles that many know they may not survive. Peterson consistently treats armies not as anonymous masses, but as collections of human beings carrying individual fears and hopes. Another defining aspect of Peterson's vision involved rejecting simplistic notions of heroes and villains. Many historical epics present one side as morally righteous while portraying the opposing force as fundamentally evil. Peterson deliberately avoided this structure. Although audiences naturally spend significant time with Achilles and the Greek forces, Troy repeatedly encourages sympathy for both Greeks and Trojans. Hector represents perhaps the clearest example of this balanced perspective. He is technically fighting against several of the film's primary protagonists, yet Peterson portrays him as honorable, compassionate, intelligent, and devoted to his family. Likewise, King Priam demonstrates wisdom and dignity even while defending a city whose leadership occasionally makes questionable decisions. On the Greek side, Achilles earns admiration through courage and honesty despite his arrogance, while Agamemnon often appears ruthless despite leading the invading coalition. Peterson wanted audiences to understand that wars rarely divide neatly into good people and bad people. Instead, conflicts emerge from competing ambitions, obligations, misunderstandings, and personal desires. This moral complexity extends to Paris as well. In many traditional retellings, Paris functions almost entirely as the selfish prince whose reckless decision causes unimaginable suffering. Peterson softens this interpretation considerably. While Paris remains impulsive and often immature, the director emphasizes his genuine love for Helen rather than reducing him to vanity or lust. This choice encourages viewers to consider how deeply personal emotions can unexpectedly trigger catastrophic historical events. Peterson also viewed family as the emotional anchor of the story. Nearly every major relationship revolves around familial bonds rather than romantic ones. Hector protects Paris despite disagreeing with him. One of the greatest strengths of Troy is the way it constructs an ancient world that feels tangible, inhabited, and believable. Unlike many historical epics or fantasy films that rely heavily on exposition to explain their settings, Troy allows its world to emerge naturally through architecture, landscapes, customs, political relationships, and the everyday behavior of its characters. The audience is never given a lengthy history lesson about the civilizations involved. Instead, Viewers gradually understand how this version of the Bronze Age functions simply by observing how people live, rule, fight, worship, and interact with one another. From its opening moments, the film establishes a world defined by power rather than law. Kingdoms constantly compete for territory, wealth, and influence. Alliances are temporary. Kings seek opportunities to expand their empires, and military strength determines political authority. There is no unified nation or international organization capable of preventing conflict. Every city-state survives largely through its own resources, diplomatic skill, and military capability. This creates an environment where war is not an extraordinary event, but an accepted part of political life. The film immediately communicates this reality during the duel between Achilles and Boagrius. Instead of sending entire armies into battle, two rival kingdoms agree to let their greatest warriors decide the outcome through single combat. This custom reveals much about the culture without requiring anyone to explain it directly. Honor, reputation, and personal courage hold enormous value. A single individual can determine the fate of hundreds of soldiers. Military excellence is not merely admired. It is one of the highest forms of social status. This emphasis on reputation influences nearly every aspect of the world's social structure. Warriors pursue glory because their names may outlive them. Kings seek conquest because expanding their kingdoms strengthens their legacies. Princes are expected to defend their cities regardless of personal risk. Women of noble birth often become symbols of political alliances or royal prestige. Individual desires frequently collide with social expectations, creating many of the film's central conflicts. The geographical setting plays an equally important role. Although Troy focuses primarily on two civilizations, the world feels much larger than the locations shown on screen. Characters frequently reference distant kingdoms, neighboring rulers, trade routes, previous wars, and future ambitions. Agamemnon's growing empire stretches across much of Greece. Sparta occupies an influential position within the Greek alliance. Troy controls valuable trade passing through the Dardanelles, making it one of the wealthiest cities in the region. These references suggest an interconnected political landscape extending far beyond the camera's frame. The sea functions almost like another major character throughout the film. Nearly every significant event depends upon maritime travel. The Greeks crossed the Aegean with an enormous fleet. Diplomats journey between kingdoms by ship. Trade enriches Troy because of its strategic coastal location. Reinforcements and supplies move across the water rather than overland. This constant relationship with the sea reinforces the realities of Bronze Age civilization, where naval power often determined economic and military success. The arrival of the Greek fleet remains one of the film's most effective world-building moments. Thousands of ships gradually appear along the horizon, transforming the calm coastline into the staging ground for one of history's most famous sieges. The sheer number of vessels immediately communicates the enormous scale of Agamemnon's coalition. Without lengthy dialogue, viewers understand that nearly every major Greek kingdom has united for this campaign. The visual itself becomes an explanation of the political world. The city of Troy serves as the centerpiece of the film's setting, and its design communicates both prosperity and vulnerability. Massive stone walls dominate the landscape, immediately establishing Troy as an engineering marvel and a military fortress. The walls symbolize centuries of stability, suggesting a civilization that has successfully defended itself against previous threats. At the same time, their imposing height creates a psychological impression of permanence that later becomes tragically ironic. Inside the city, Troy feels remarkably alive. Rather than functioning merely as a backdrop for royal scenes, it appears to be a functioning urban center filled with merchants, craftsmen, priests, soldiers, servants, and ordinary citizens. People move through markets, temples, courtyards, and narrow streets with a sense of routine. This attention to daily life prevents the city from feeling like an empty movie set awaiting battle. The palace itself reflects the values of Trojan society. It is elegant without appearing excessively extravagant. Large open spaces encourage gatherings of advisors and family members. Natural light fills many rooms, creating an atmosphere that contrasts sharply with the harsher military camps of the Greeks. Decorative sculptures, carved pillars, and carefully designed courtyards emphasize cultural refinement. These visual choices reinforce the idea that Troy is not merely wealthy, but also deeply rooted in artistic and intellectual traditions. Religious architecture occupies an equally significant place within the city. Temples, statues, sacred fires, and ceremonial spaces appear throughout the film, reminding audiences that spiritual belief influences nearly every aspect of daily life. Even though the movie removes literal divine intervention, religion remains central to the characters' understanding of existence. Kings seek blessings before major decisions. Priests interpret signs. Families pray for protection. Warriors ask for courage before entering battle. Importantly, Peterson presents religion as a genuine force within society rather than simply a collection of rituals. Characters sincerely believe the gods influence their fortunes, even if the audience never witnesses supernatural confirmation. This approach strengthens immersion because belief itself shapes behavior regardless of whether miracles occur. At first glance, Troy appears to fit comfortably into the category of a historical epic. It features massive armies, legendary warriors, spectacular battles, elaborate costumes, and a story that unfolds on a grand scale involving the fate of entire civilizations. However, reducing the film to simply a historical epic overlooks the complexity of its storytelling. Troy is a film that exists at the intersection of several genres, borrowing conventions from historical drama, war films, political thrillers, romantic tragedies, action cinema, and classical mythology, while deliberately rejecting many of the fantasy elements audiences might expect from a story based on ancient Greek legends. This blending of genres is one of the reasons the film continues to generate discussion years after its release. It follows many traditions established by earlier epics, while also making creative choices that distinguish it from both classic sword and sandal adventures and modern fantasy blockbusters. Rather than embracing mythology as literal truth, it transforms legendary material into a grounded human drama. This decision reshapes nearly every aspect of the movie's identity. The film's primary genre is undoubtedly the historical epic. Although the events depicted are inspired by mythology rather than fully documented history, the presentation deliberately imitates historical realism. The audience is invited to believe that these events could have happened in a recognizable ancient civilization. Grand architecture, political negotiations, military campaigns, royal courts, and enormous battles all reinforce this identity. Historical epics traditionally focus on events that alter the course of nations rather than individual lives alone. Troy follows this convention closely. The central conflict is not merely a dispute between two families or two rival warriors. Instead, it becomes a war involving thousands of soldiers, multiple kingdoms, shifting alliances, and consequences that reshape the ancient world. Every personal decision eventually influences the destiny of entire civilizations. Like many classic epics, Troy also emphasizes scale. The production constantly reminds viewers that individual actions exist within much larger historical movements. Wide shots reveal fleets stretching across the sea, armies assembling before towering walls, and battlefields filled with thousands of combatants. These images reinforce one of the defining characteristics of epic storytelling. Individuals may be extraordinary, but history itself is even larger. However, unlike many earlier historical epics, Troy avoids portraying history as a simple struggle between good and evil. Traditional epics often celebrate clear heroes overcoming obviously villainous enemies. Peterson's film instead embraces moral ambiguity. Both Greeks and Trojans receive sympathetic treatment. Each side contains honorable individuals as well as deeply flawed leaders. This complexity aligns the film more closely with modern historical dramas than with older adventure spectacles. The second major genre influencing Troy is the war film. While many viewers focus on its mythology, much of the movie actually functions according to conventions established by realistic military cinema. The battles emphasize strategy, leadership, logistics, morale, sacrifice, and psychological pressure rather than simply showcasing action. Throughout the film, warfare is portrayed as exhausting and deeply costly. Victories never feel entirely triumphant because nearly every success carries significant losses. Soldiers die suddenly and often anonymously. Leaders struggle to balance military necessity against personal loyalty. The longer the conflict continues, the more obvious its human cost becomes. This perspective separates Troy from action-oriented fantasy films where battles primarily exist to entertain. Peterson repeatedly reminds audiences that war destroys families, cities, friendships, and futures. Even spectacular combat sequences are often followed by moments of grief, mourning, or reflection. Funeral ceremonies receive nearly as much emotional attention as battlefield victories. Another characteristic borrowed from war films is the importance of command structures. Military leadership becomes a recurring source of tension throughout the story. Agamemnon views war primarily as an opportunity for conquest. Achilles prioritizes personal honor above political objectives. Hector seeks defensive strategies that preserve civilian lives. Odysseus frequently advocates practical solutions over emotional reactions. These competing leadership philosophies create internal conflicts that often prove just as important as the battles themselves. The greatest threats do not always come from enemy armies. Pride, ambition, jealousy, and political disagreements repeatedly undermine military effectiveness. This emphasis on leadership echoes many modern war dramas where decisions made by commanders shape the fate of countless ordinary soldiers. The film also incorporates significant elements of political drama. Long before armies clash outside Troy's walls, the story revolves around negotiations, alliances, diplomatic missions, and struggles for influence. Kings constantly evaluate risks, calculate advantages, and pursue their own strategic interests. Agamemnon represents political ambition in its purest form. Although the official reason for invading Troy is Helen's return, Agamemnon's true objective is expanding his empire. The war becomes a convenient justification for territorial conquest. His manipulation of political circumstances reflects themes commonly found in political thrillers, where public explanations often conceal deeper motivations. King Priam provides an effective contrast. His leadership emphasizes diplomacy, tradition, and responsibility toward his people rather than personal expansion. The conflict between these two rulers illustrates differing philosophies of governance rather than merely opposing national interests. Political maneuvering also appears within the Greek alliance itself. Achilles openly challenges Agamemnon's authority. Other kings must decide where their loyalties truly lie. Odysseus often functions as mediator between competing personalities. These internal struggles create dramatic tension even during periods without active combat. The opening 15 minutes of Troy accomplish one of the most important tasks in filmmaking. Before the audience becomes invested in the Trojan War, the film must establish its world, introduce its central themes, define its major characters, and communicate the scale of the story that is about to unfold. Wolfgang Petersen and his creative team achieve this with remarkable efficiency. Rather than beginning with the famous image of the Trojan Horse or the romance between Paris and Helen, the film opens with a conflict that initially appears unrelated to the main narrative. This decision is deliberate. Instead of immediately telling viewers about Troy, the film first teaches them how this world works. The opening image presents two armies facing one another across an open plain. There is no immediate action. Instead, there is silence, tension, and anticipation. Soldiers wait, commanders observe, and both sides understand that violence is only moments away. This quiet beginning immediately establishes one of the film's recurring ideas. War is not simply chaos. It is built upon rituals, traditions, negotiations, and carefully observed customs. Even before swords are drawn, the audience senses that this society possesses its own rules regarding honor and combat. The landscape itself contributes to this first impression. There are no towering castles or magical kingdoms. The environment feels natural, harsh, and exposed. Dry fields stretch beneath an open sky, emphasizing both the vulnerability of the soldiers and the absence of modern civilization. The world immediately feels ancient without requiring narration to explain its historical setting. King Agamemnon soon enters the scene, and within only a few moments the audience begins to understand his personality. He arrives not merely as a military commander, but as a ruler accustomed to victory. His confidence borders on arrogance. He expects submission rather than negotiation. Through brief dialogue, the film reveals that Agamemnon has already conquered numerous kingdoms and continues expanding his influence across Greece. What makes this introduction effective is its restraint. The screenplay never stops to deliver a lengthy biography explaining Agamemnon's past. Instead, other characters react to him with caution and respect, allowing viewers to infer his reputation naturally. This approach demonstrates one of the film's strongest storytelling techniques. Information emerges through behavior rather than exposition. The opposing king hesitates before accepting Agamemnon's demands. Rather than sacrificing thousands of soldiers in open battle, the rulers agree to resolve their dispute according to tradition. Each kingdom will send forth its greatest warrior, and the duel will determine the outcome of the conflict. This decision immediately establishes the values governing this society. Personal courage carries extraordinary importance. Individual champions possess enough influence to determine political outcomes. Reputation matters almost as much as military strength. Before the audience meets any of the principal characters, they already understand that warriors occupy a unique place within this civilization. At this point, the film introduces one of its most important recurring themes: the relationship between fear and reputation. The opposing champion, Boagrius, is presented as an intimidating figure. He towers over nearly everyone around him. His physical size alone suggests overwhelming strength. His armor appears heavy and imposing. Soldiers watch him with confidence, believing that no ordinary opponent could survive such a confrontation. Then comes one of the most memorable entrances in the film. Achilles is nowhere to be found. This absence tells the audience almost as much about his personality as his eventual appearance. Agamemnon grows impatient. Other commanders become frustrated. The greatest warrior in Greece is apparently asleep while armies wait for him. When Odysseus finally finds Achilles resting peacefully, another important aspect of his character becomes clear. Achilles does not share Agamemnon's ambitions. He is not driven by politics, territorial conquest, or royal authority. He fights because he seeks something deeper and more personal: eternal glory. This conversation also introduces the philosophical conflict that defines Achilles throughout the entire film. Odysseus tells him that everyone is waiting. Achilles replies with complete confidence that perhaps the waiting is the best part. It is a brief exchange, yet it reveals several important qualities. Achilles possesses enormous self-confidence. He feels no urgency to satisfy kings. He understands his own value and knows that others depend upon him. Unlike traditional soldiers, he operates according to his own code. As Achilles walks toward the battlefield, Peterson deliberately delays the duel. Instead of rushing directly into combat, the camera observes the reactions of everyone present. Soldiers whisper his name. Commanders watch with anticipation. Even the opposing army appears uneasy. This technique transforms Achilles into a legendary figure before he performs a single action. The audience experiences him first through reputation rather than direct observation. Then comes the duel itself. One of the most surprising creative decisions in the opening sequence is its brevity. Many action films would extend this fight into several minutes of elaborate choreography designed primarily to entertain. Troy does the opposite. Boagrius charges with tremendous force. Achilles waits calmly. In a matter of seconds, he leaps forward, delivers a devastating strike, and kills his opponent almost instantly. The battle is over before the audience fully expects it to begin. This moment serves several purposes simultaneously. First, it immediately establishes Achilles as the greatest warrior in the world. The film does not merely tell viewers that he is legendary. It demonstrates his superiority through action. Second, the speed of a victory reinforces the film's commitment to realism. Real combat often ends quickly once one participant gains a decisive advantage. Peterson avoids transforming the duel into unrealistic spectacle. Third, the duel establishes the brutal nature of warfare. Death arrives suddenly. There is little opportunity for dramatic speeches or prolonged heroics. Skill determines survival. The reactions following the duel prove equally important. The opposing army immediately surrenders. Agamemnon's kingdom expands once again without a larger battle. One of the reasons Troy remains compelling throughout its nearly 3-hour runtime is that it never relies on a single conflict to carry the story. Instead, the film layers multiple forms of conflict on top of one another, allowing political struggles, personal rivalries, philosophical disagreements, family relationships, and large-scale warfare to constantly influence each other. Every major character faces external enemies, while simultaneously wrestling with internal dilemmas. As a result, the audience remains invested not only in who will win the war, but in how each character's choices reshape both their own destiny and the fate of everyone around them. At its core, Troy is about conflict born from human nature. Unlike many adaptations of Greek mythology, where gods manipulate events and mortals become pieces in a divine game, the film removes nearly all supernatural intervention. This creative decision dramatically changes the source of tension. Every tragedy becomes the direct consequence of human ambition, pride, love, fear, loyalty, revenge, or desperation. No invisible force compels these characters to destroy one another. They make those choices themselves. The central external conflict is immediately clear. The Greek alliance invades Troy after Paris, Prince of Troy, takes Helen away from Sparta. Officially, the objective is to return Helen to her husband, King Menelaus. However, the audience quickly realizes that this explanation represents only part of the truth. For Agamemnon, Helen serves primarily as an excuse. His real goal is empire. Throughout the opening act, the film repeatedly emphasizes that Agamemnon has spent years conquering neighboring kingdoms. Troy represents the last great obstacle preventing him from controlling nearly the entire known Greek world. The city occupies an enormously valuable strategic position, controlling important trade routes between Europe and Asia. As long as Troy remains independent, Agamemnon's dream of complete dominance cannot become reality. This transforms the war into something much larger than a romantic dispute. Although Paris and Helen ignite the conflict, political ambition keeps it burning. This distinction is essential because it reveals one of the film's recurring messages. History often remembers simple explanations for wars, while the true causes are usually far more complicated. The audience watches thousands of soldiers prepare to die because powerful rulers recognize an opportunity hidden beneath a personal scandal. While the political conflict drives the overall narrative, the emotional heart of the film comes from the internal struggles experienced by its principal characters. Achilles represents perhaps the richest example. Externally, he is almost unbeatable. No warrior can match his speed, skill, or courage. Kings depend upon him. Soldiers fear him. Enemies speak his name with awe. Yet internally, Achilles is deeply conflicted. His greatest battle is not against Hector, Troy, or Agamemnon. It is against mortality itself. From the very beginning, Achilles understands that every human being dies. The only question is whether anyone will remember them afterward. He believes ordinary lives disappear into history, while extraordinary achievements create immortality through memory. This obsession with legacy shapes nearly every decision he makes. He willingly risks death because he believes eternal fame is worth more than a long but forgotten life. However, as the story progresses, another desire slowly emerges. For perhaps the first time, Achilles begins to imagine a different future. His growing relationship with Briseis introduces the possibility of love, peace, and ordinary happiness. Suddenly, the warrior who once cared only about glory faces a painful internal contradiction. Can a man devoted to eternal fame also choose a quiet human life? The tragedy lies in the fact that these goals cannot easily coexist. Every step Achilles takes toward emotional connection moves him further away from the legend he has spent his entire life pursuing. Hector faces a very different internal conflict. Unlike Achilles, Hector does not seek personal greatness. His primary motivation is responsibility. He is a son, a husband, a father, a prince, a military commander. Every decision he makes must consider the safety of people depending upon him. This creates enormous psychological pressure. Hector frequently recognizes better strategic options than those ultimately chosen, yet duty prevents him from acting solely according to personal preference. He repeatedly protects Paris despite disagreeing with his younger brother's actions. He obeys his father while carrying the burden of military leadership. He places Troy's survival above his own happiness. This makes Hector one of the film's most tragic figures. His strengths become the source of his suffering. Because he is honorable, he cannot abandon his family. Because he is loyal, he cannot reject his responsibilities. Because he loves Troy, he remains inside a city whose destruction increasingly appears inevitable. The audience understands that Hector's greatest enemy is not Achilles. His obligation. Paris embodies another form of internal conflict. Unlike Hector, Paris initially prioritizes personal emotion over public responsibility. His love for Helen feels genuine. He does not deliberately seek war. He simply believes that love justifies extraordinary risks. However, once the invasion begins, Paris gradually confronts the consequences of his choices. Thousands of people begin dying because of a decision he considered intensely personal. This realization becomes one of the defining aspects of his character arc. The carefree young prince slowly develops greater awareness of leadership, sacrifice, and responsibility. His internal struggle revolves around guilt. Can he justify his happiness knowing others suffer because of it? Can love survive once it becomes associated with unimaginable destruction? Agamemnon experiences perhaps the simplest internal conflict, though it remains dramatically important. His overwhelming ambition blinds him to nearly every other consideration. Unlike Hector or Achilles, Agamemnon rarely questions himself. Instead, his conflict emerges through increasing frustration whenever reality refuses to match his expectations. He expects loyalty. Achilles challenges him. He expects quick victory. Troy resists. One of the most fascinating aspects of Troy is that it refuses to present a traditional villain. Unlike many epic adventures in which a single evil character drives the conflict, Troy creates a world where nearly every major figure possesses understandable motivations, admirable qualities, and significant flaws. The audience is constantly encouraged to sympathize with people on both sides of the war. As a result, the true antagonistic force is not simply one person or one army, but a combination of ambition, pride, revenge, political greed, fate, and the destructive consequences of human decisions. This layered approach gives the story much greater emotional depth. If Troy had relied on a stereotypical villain who existed only to create obstacles, the conflict would have felt far less realistic. Instead, the film demonstrates that wars rarely begin because one individual is completely evil. More often, they emerge when multiple people pursue goals that cannot peacefully coexist. Among the human characters, King Agamemnon functions as the closest thing the film has to a conventional antagonist. While other characters fight to protect family, honor, or love, Agamemnon fights primarily for power. His ambition extends far beyond recovering Helen or defending Greek honor. From the very beginning of the film, it becomes clear that he views every political crisis as an opportunity to expand his empire. The opening sequence immediately establishes this aspect of his personality. After Achilles defeats Boagrius, Agamemnon accepts the surrender of another kingdom without hesitation. There is no celebration of peace, no concern for the defeated people, and no suggestion that conquest carries moral weight. Expansion itself appears to be his primary objective. This introduction is important because it tells the audience that Agamemnon's campaign against Troy is part of a much larger pattern. He has spent years absorbing neighboring kingdoms. He intends to continue until no significant rivals remain. Helen's disappearance simply provides a politically acceptable excuse for invading the richest independent city in the region. This makes Agamemnon a particularly effective antagonist because his motivations feel believable. History contains countless examples of rulers who justified territorial expansion through moral arguments while pursuing personal power. Rather than creating a fictional monster, the film presents a recognizable form of political ambition that has appeared throughout human civilization. Another reason Agamemnon works as an antagonist is that he rarely displays internal conflict. Most major characters experience moments of doubt. Achilles questions the meaning of glory. Hector struggles with responsibility. Paris wrestles with guilt. Priam balances wisdom against emotional attachment. Agamemnon, however, almost never questions his own actions. Every setback simply convinces him to pursue victory more aggressively. This unwavering confidence makes him dangerous. Unlike emotionally complex characters who reconsider difficult choices, Agamemnon interprets hesitation as weakness. Compromise rarely interests him. Mercy offers little strategic value. People become tools serving larger political ambitions. His treatment of Achilles illustrates this mindset clearly. Although Achilles wins critical victories for the Greek alliance, Agamemnon never truly appreciates him as an individual. Instead, he views Achilles as another military resource that should obey royal authority. This inability to understand human complexity repeatedly creates conflict within the Greek camp. Ironically, Agamemnon often proves almost as dangerous to his own allies as he is to Troy. His pride prevents effective cooperation. His greed damages morale. His obsession with control creates unnecessary divisions among commanders. In many ways, the Greek army's greatest internal obstacle is not Trojan resistance, but Agamemnon's leadership. However, calling Agamemnon the sole villain would oversimplify the film considerably. Paris also functions as an antagonistic force, although in a very different way. Unlike Agamemnon, Paris never intends to cause suffering. His motivations emerge from genuine love rather than selfish conquest. Yet his decisions produce catastrophic consequences. This reflects one of the film's most important themes. Good intentions do not eliminate responsibility. Paris knows Helen is married. He understands that taking her away from Sparta risks diplomatic disaster. Nevertheless, he chooses personal happiness over political stability. From his perspective, the decision appears deeply romantic. From the perspective of thousands of soldiers who eventually die outside Troy's walls, the consequences become unimaginable. The audience experiences conflicting emotions toward Paris throughout the story. His vulnerability makes him sympathetic. His immaturity makes him frustrating. His love feels sincere. His lack of foresight feels devastating. This complexity prevents viewers from reducing him to either hero or villain. Instead, he becomes a tragic example of how private choices can reshape history. Menelaus serves another antagonistic role, though his motivations differ significantly from Agamemnon's. His desire to recover Helen and restore personal honor feels understandable. His wife has left him. His reputation has been damaged. His authority has been publicly challenged. Unlike Agamemnon, Menelaus possesses genuine personal reasons for wanting war. However, once conflict begins, revenge increasingly influences his actions. His pursuit of justice gradually becomes indistinguishable from his desire for vengeance. The film suggests that wounded pride often escalates conflicts beyond rational limits. Had Menelaus possessed greater emotional restraint, events might have unfolded differently. Instead, personal humiliation combines with Agamemnon's political ambition to create an unstoppable military campaign. Achilles presents one of the film's most interesting cases because he functions simultaneously as protagonist and antagonist. From the Greek perspective, he is their greatest champion. From Troy's perspective, he is a terrifying force of destruction. The audience frequently admires his courage, intelligence, and honesty. Yet many Trojan characters experience him as a nightmare. Although Troy is an ensemble film featuring numerous major characters, the emotional and narrative center of the story is Achilles. The film constantly shifts attention between Hector, Paris, Agamemnon, Priam, Helen, and Odysseus. Yet Achilles remains the character whose personal transformation most closely follows a recognizable mythic structure. Interestingly, this journey is not a traditional hero's journey in the pure sense described by Joseph Campbell. Instead, Troy adapts many elements of Campbell's model while blending them with classical Greek tragedy. Achilles begins as an almost mythical warrior who believes he understands the purpose of his life. By the end of the film, he discovers that the glory he spent his entire existence pursuing may never have been enough. His journey is therefore less about becoming a hero and more about discovering what kind of man he truly wants to be before death claims him. The hero's journey traditionally begins with the ordinary world, where the audience sees the protagonist before adventure changes them. Troy presents an unusual variation of this stage. Achilles does not live an ordinary life. He is already the greatest warrior in Greece. Kings depend upon him. Entire armies fear him. Songs are already being written about his victories. Instead of beginning with an unknown individual destined for greatness, the film introduces someone who has already achieved legendary status. This inversion immediately distinguishes Troy from many heroic narratives. The audience does not watch Achilles become extraordinary. Instead, they watch an extraordinary man question whether extraordinary achievement is truly enough. His ordinary world is therefore a life defined by warfare, reputation, and endless combat. Battlefields are his home. Violence is his profession. Glory is his purpose. Everything about his identity revolves around being remembered. The call to adventure arrives almost immediately. Agamemnon summons Achilles to fight another battle that will expand Greek power. On the surface, this appears to be just another military campaign. For Achilles, however, every battle represents another opportunity to secure immortality through legend. His mother has previously warned him of two possible futures. He may live a long, peaceful life forgotten by history, or he may achieve everlasting fame through a short but glorious existence. Achilles has already chosen the second path long before the film begins. The campaign against Troy, therefore, becomes the greatest opportunity of his life. Unlike reluctant heroes who hesitate before accepting adventure, Achilles eagerly embraces conflict. His confidence borders on absolute certainty. He believes he already understands his destiny. This confidence actually functions as one of his greatest weaknesses. Traditional heroes' journey stories often include a refusal of the call. Achilles offers an interesting variation. He never refuses battle itself. Instead, he refuses authority. His disagreements with Agamemnon reveal that Achilles fights for his own reasons rather than for kings or politics. He rejects obedience while accepting adventure. This distinction becomes crucial throughout the film. Although technically serving the Greek alliance, Achilles constantly reminds everyone that he cannot be controlled. His loyalty belongs only to his personal code. This independence isolates him from nearly every other leader. The meeting with the mentor stage also receives an unconventional interpretation. Achilles never possesses one clear mentor. Instead, different characters influence different aspects of his development. Odysseus often serves as the voice of wisdom. Unlike Agamemnon, Odysseus understands Achilles as both warrior and human being. He recognizes the younger man's obsession with legacy while quietly encouraging broader perspectives. Their conversations frequently explore questions larger than military strategy. What gives life meaning? What makes someone immortal? Why do people remember certain names across generations? Odysseus rarely lectures Achilles directly. Instead, he plants ideas that slowly influence Achilles' thinking. Briseis eventually becomes another form of mentor, though in a very different way. She does not teach military tactics or philosophy. She teaches emotional vulnerability. Until meeting her, Achilles defines strength almost exclusively through physical superiority. Briseis introduces another possibility: compassion, love, forgiveness, connection. These qualities challenge Achilles' understanding of greatness. Crossing the first threshold occurs when Achilles lands on the beaches outside Troy. Although he has fought countless battles before, this invasion differs from everything that came earlier. The city possesses legendary defenses. The campaign involves nearly every Greek kingdom. History itself seems to await the outcome. Once Achilles steps on a Trojan soil, there is no returning to ordinary military campaigns. He has entered the story that future generations will remember forever. The landing sequence reinforces this transition beautifully. Achilles leads the Myrmidons in a daring assault before the main Greek army fully arrives. This action immediately demonstrates both his confidence and his willingness to act independently. It also establishes Troy as fundamentally different from previous conquests. The city resists. Its defenders possess courage matching their attackers. Its leaders command respect rather than ridicule. The adventure has truly begun. The road of trials occupies much of the film's middle portion. Unlike simple action stories where trials consist only of physical battles, Achilles faces challenges on multiple levels. He must navigate his deteriorating relationship with Agamemnon. He must reconcile personal honor with military necessity. He develops unexpected feelings for Briseis. He witnesses the consequences of prolonged warfare. Most importantly, he begins questioning whether endless glory can satisfy the emotional emptiness growing inside him. Each challenge slowly reshapes his priorities. At first, he dismisses politics entirely. Eventually, political decisions directly affect people he cares about. Initially, he values only victory. Gradually, individual lives become more important. The film carefully avoids rushing this transformation. Achilles changes through accumulated experiences rather than sudden revelation. One particularly significant trial involves Patroclus. In many versions of Greek mythology, Patroclus represents Achilles' closest companion. When Troy was released in 2004, it represented one of the most ambitious technical productions of its era. Although audiences often remember the film for its performances, large-scale battles, and emotional storytelling, much of what made the movie believable depended on an enormous combination of practical filmmaking, computer-generated imagery, stunt choreography, production design, visual effects, miniature work, sound design, and digital compositing. Rather than relying entirely on CGI, which was becoming increasingly common during the early 2000s, director Wolfgang Petersen chose a balanced approach. He believed that audiences would respond more strongly to environments, armies, and action that felt physically real. The result was a film that blended traditional filmmaking techniques with cutting-edge digital technology, creating an epic that still appears remarkably convincing more than 2 decades later. One of the guiding principles behind Troy's visual effects was realism. The filmmakers never wanted viewers to feel as though they were watching a fantasy filled with impossible imagery. Instead, every technological decision served one primary purpose: to convince the audience that they were witnessing an actual civilization that once existed. This philosophy influenced every department. Visual effects artists worked closely with production designers. Costume designers collaborated with stunt coordinators. Digital artists enhanced practical photography instead of replacing it. The result is a movie where technology supports storytelling rather than distracting from it. Perhaps the most impressive technical achievement was the creation of the massive Greek army. Obviously, the production could not hire tens of thousands of extras. Instead, the filmmakers combined several techniques. Thousands of real extras participated during principal photography. These performers occupied the foreground of battle scenes, giving actors genuine people to interact with during combat. Behind them, digital duplication technology multiplied the number of soldiers. Individual groups of extras were photographed repeatedly from different positions. Computers then combined these separate performances into one enormous army stretching across the landscape. Unlike earlier visual effects that often looked repetitive because identical digital figures appeared over and over again, Troy carefully varied movements, costumes, shields, and formations to reduce obvious duplication. This subtle variation greatly increased realism. The audience rarely notices where practical photography ends and computer-generated imagery begins. The arrival of the Greek fleet demonstrates this perfectly. One of the film's most unforgettable images shows thousands of ships appearing across the sea before landing on Trojan shores. Building thousands of full-size ships would have been impossible. Instead, the production constructed several complete vessels for close-up photography. Additional partial ships allowed actors to perform realistic boarding and landing sequences. The remainder of the fleet was created digitally. Computer-generated ships extended the practical fleet far beyond the visible horizon. Careful lighting and ocean simulations helped these digital vessels blend seamlessly with the real ones. Even today, the sequence remains remarkably convincing because digital effects were designed to complement practical filmmaking rather than dominate it. The city of Troy itself represents another extraordinary technological accomplishment. While large portions of the city were physically constructed, only selected sections actually existed. The massive walls, palace courtyards, gates, staircases, and important streets were built as enormous practical sets. Actors could walk through them naturally. Camera crews enjoyed realistic perspectives. Lighting interacted authentically with stone surfaces. However, many surrounding buildings, towers, distant walls, and skyline elements existed only inside computers. Visual effects artists extended every practical set digitally. As a result, relatively small construction projects appeared to become an immense city capable of housing thousands of people. This combination proved essential. Entirely digital cities often looked artificial during the early 2000s. Entirely practical cities would have been financially impossible. The hybrid solution achieved both realism and scale. Miniature models also played a surprisingly important role. Although CGI receives most public attention, traditional miniature photography remained an important tool during production. Detailed scale models allowed filmmakers to capture realistic destruction, architectural detail, and environmental interaction that sometimes proved more convincing than contemporary computer graphics. Miniatures offered genuine lighting, authentic shadows, and physical textures naturally difficult to reproduce digitally at the time. Many establishing shots combined miniature photography with digital extensions, creating seamless transitions between physical models and computer-generated environments. One of the film's greatest technical strengths involves its battle choreography. Unlike fantasy films where action frequently ignores realistic military tactics, Troy worked closely with fight choreographers, stunt performers, and military consultants to create combat that felt grounded. Every important actor underwent extensive weapons training before filming began. Brad Pitt devoted months to learning sword combat, designed specifically for Achilles. Rather than portraying him as simply stronger than everyone else, the choreography emphasized speed, balance, precision, and extraordinary athleticism. Achilles fights differently from every other character. His movements appear fluid. He attacks aggressively. He wastes almost no energy. Every strike serves a purpose. This unique fighting style instantly distinguishes him from ordinary soldiers. Bana approached Hector differently. Hector's combat style emphasizes discipline, patience, and defensive awareness. Unlike Achilles, who often overwhelms opponents through relentless offense, Hector carefully studies enemy movements before responding. This contrast becomes especially important during their famous duel. Without requiring dialogue, the choreography communicates different philosophies of warfare. Achilles fights like someone pursuing glory. Hector fights like someone protecting responsibility. The duel between Achilles and Hector remains one of the finest examples of practical action filmmaking from the period. While Troy is remembered for its breathtaking battles, legendary heroes, and grand historical setting, its lasting impact comes from something much more personal. Beneath the swords, armies, and political intrigue lies a deeply emotional story about love, family, sacrifice, ambition, mortality, and the price of war. The film succeeds because it never allows its spectacular action to overshadow the humanity of its characters. Every major battle has emotional consequences. Every victory carries a painful cost. Every death changes the lives of those left behind. Instead of asking the audience to simply admire great warriors, Troy asks them to understand what those warriors are fighting for, what they are willing to sacrifice, and whether the glory they seek is truly worth the price. One of the film's greatest emotional strengths is that it refuses to portray war as entertainment alone. Many historical action films celebrate victory with triumphant music, heroic speeches, and scenes of celebration. Troy often does the opposite. Moments of success are frequently followed by grief. After battles come funerals. After victories come difficult conversations. After acts of heroism come reminders that even the greatest warriors cannot escape death. This emotional rhythm prevents audiences from becoming emotionally detached from the violence. Every sword strike carries weight because viewers understand that every fallen soldier was someone's son, husband, father, brother, or friend. This approach creates an atmosphere of constant emotional tension. Even during scenes filled with excitement, there is an underlying awareness that tragedy is never far away. The emotional journey begins with Achilles. At first, he appears almost emotionally untouchable. He is confident, fearless, and completely devoted to the pursuit of glory. He speaks openly about death without appearing to fear it. He believes that a short life remembered forever is preferable to a long life forgotten. This philosophy initially makes him seem almost superhuman. He behaves as though emotions cannot distract him from his destiny. However, as the story progresses, the audience begins discovering the humanity hidden beneath his legendary reputation. His relationship with Briseis becomes one of the most important emotional threads in the film. Unlike many romances that develop through dramatic declarations of love, their relationship evolves gradually. It begins with distrust. Briseis sees Achilles as a brutal conqueror responsible for enormous suffering. Achilles initially treats her almost as another consequence of war. Neither character expects genuine emotional connection. What makes their relationship compelling is its subtlety. They change one another through conversation rather than dramatic spectacle. Briseis challenges Achilles' understanding of honor. She questions his pursuit of fame. She forces him to consider whether greatness measured only through violence truly deserves admiration. For perhaps the first time, Achilles encounters someone who refuses to be impressed by his reputation. This deeply affects him. Likewise, Briseis slowly recognizes that beneath his arrogance exists someone capable of compassion. The emotional transformation occurs through small moments rather than grand gestures. A quiet conversation, a moment of vulnerability, an expression of doubt. These intimate scenes provide essential balance against the film's enormous battles. Without them, Achilles would remain an impressive warrior but not a fully developed human being. Another deeply emotional storyline centers on Hector and his family. If Achilles represents the pursuit of eternal glory, Hector represents the value of ordinary human life. His scenes with Andromache and their young son repeatedly remind the audience what is truly at stake. Unlike Achilles, Hector does not dream of being remembered forever. He dreams of protecting the people he loves. Every time he leaves for battle, the audience understands that he risks leaving his family behind forever. This knowledge transforms every military decision into something intensely personal. One of the film's most moving moments occurs before Hector's final confrontation with Achilles. He says goodbye to Andromache, knowing he may never return. The scene contains very little dramatic spectacle. Instead, its emotional power comes from restraint. Neither character wants to say goodbye. Neither wishes to acknowledge what both already know. The silence between them communicates as much as the dialogue itself. The audience realizes that this may be the last peaceful moment they ever share. When Hector later embraces his son, the emotional stakes become even greater. His child is too young to understand what is happening. The audience, however, understands perfectly. This creates dramatic irony. Viewers experience sadness not because of what the child knows, but because of what he does not. The innocence of the moment contrasts painfully with the violence waiting outside Troy's walls. This sequence reminds audiences that wars affect generations, not merely soldiers. Perhaps no scene captures the emotional devastation of war more effectively than Hector's death. By the time Achilles challenges him, viewers have developed deep affection for both men. Unlike traditional action films where audiences clearly support one fighter over another, Troy creates an extraordinary emotional conflict. Achilles deserves revenge for Patroclus. Hector deserves to defend his city. Neither man is morally simple. The audience understands both perspectives simultaneously. As the duel unfolds, excitement gradually gives way to sadness. Every strike brings Hector closer to death. Every successful defense delays the inevitable. Because viewers respect both warriors, the fight becomes emotionally exhausting. When Hector finally falls, there is no feeling of celebration. Instead, the audience experiences the painful recognition that two honorable men have destroyed each other emotionally, even though only one has died physically. The aftermath intensifies these emotions. Achilles drags Hector's body behind his chariot. This shocking act deliberately unsettles viewers. Only minutes earlier, Achilles appeared almost sympathetic because of his grief over Patroclus. Now his rage strips away that sympathy. The audience witnesses how overwhelming sorrow can transform even admirable individuals into people capable of terrible actions. Rather than simplifying grief into noble sadness, the film portrays mourning as chaotic, irrational, and deeply destructive. One of the most discussed aspects of Troy is the way it adapts one of the most influential works in world literature, while simultaneously choosing not to be a faithful adaptation. Unlike many films based on novels that attempt to recreate their source material scene by scene, Troy takes a much broader approach. It draws inspiration primarily from Homer's Iliad, but also incorporates characters and events from later Greek myths that are not actually part of Homer's poem. At the same time, it removes many of the supernatural elements that define ancient mythology and reshapes the story into a grounded historical drama. The result is not a direct translation of the Iliad, but a modern reinterpretation designed for contemporary audiences. Understanding the adaptation requires first understanding the source material. Many people believe the Iliad tells the complete story of the Trojan War. It does not. In reality, Homer's poem covers only a small portion of the conflict. The Trojan War itself lasts 10 years, but the Iliad focuses on only a few weeks during the final year of the siege. More importantly, many of the events that modern audiences associate with the Trojan War never appear in Homer's poem at all. The famous Trojan Horse, the fall of the city, Achilles' death, the escape of Aeneas, the destruction of Troy. These events belong to later Greek traditions, Roman literature, and other ancient sources rather than the Iliad itself. From the beginning, the filmmakers faced a major challenge. If they adapted only Homer's poem, audiences expecting the complete Trojan War would likely feel disappointed. If they attempted to include every surviving myth, the film would become impossibly long and dramatically unfocused. The solution was to create a single narrative combining material from multiple ancient traditions into one continuous story. This decision fundamentally shaped every aspect of the screenplay. Perhaps the most dramatic change involves the gods. In Greek mythology, the Olympian gods are central characters. Zeus, Athena, Apollo, Hera, Aphrodite, Poseidon, Ares, and others constantly interfere with human affairs. They rescue heroes. They influence battles. They argue among themselves. They manipulate emotions. They even physically enter battlefields. In Homer's Iliad, divine intervention is not symbolic. It is literal. When warriors survive impossible situations, gods often protect them. When battles suddenly change direction, divine powers frequently influence the outcome. Human destiny and divine politics become inseparable. Troy removes almost all of this. The gods never physically appear. Miracles never occur. No supernatural force visibly alters history. Religion remains important because the characters sincerely believe in divine power, but the audience never witnesses undeniable evidence that the gods actually intervene. This single creative decision transforms the genre. Instead of mythological fantasy, Troy becomes historical drama. Instead of emphasizing destiny controlled by immortal beings, the film emphasizes responsibility. Every triumph and every tragedy result from human choices. Some viewers praised this grounded interpretation because it made the story more accessible. Others criticized it for removing one of Greek mythology's defining characteristics. Either way, the absence of the gods completely changes the meaning of many events. Achilles himself undergoes enormous adaptation. In Greek mythology, Achilles is not simply an extraordinary warrior. He is the son of the sea goddess Thetis. His semi-divine nature explains much of his incredible strength and battlefield superiority. His legendary invulnerability, except for his heel, has become one of mythology's most famous stories. Interestingly, the Iliad never actually describes Achilles as completely invulnerable. The famous Achilles' heel story developed later in ancient tradition. Troy simplifies this mythology significantly. Achilles becomes entirely human. His greatness comes through discipline, talent, confidence, and experience rather than divine ancestry. This change allows audiences to admire his achievements without relying upon supernatural explanation. His mortality becomes more immediate. His victories feel earned rather than predetermined. His emotional transformation also gains greater importance because nothing about him is magically exceptional. He becomes a man struggling with ambition rather than a demigod fulfilling destiny. Briseis experiences one of the largest changes in the adaptation. In the Iliad, Briseis is primarily a captured woman whose removal from Achilles creates conflict between him and Agamemnon. Although emotionally important, her role remains relatively limited. The film expands her dramatically. She becomes a priestess. She challenges Achilles' philosophy. She influences his emotional growth. She develops into one of the story's primary moral voices. This expansion serves several purposes. It provides Achilles with meaningful emotional development. It humanizes him beyond warfare. It creates opportunities to explore themes of love, compassion, and forgiveness. Rather than existing mainly as a symbol of honor, Briseis becomes an active participant in Achilles' transformation. Patroclus also receives substantial changes. Ancient sources generally describe Patroclus as Achilles' closest companion and fellow warrior. Their relationship has inspired centuries of scholarly discussion regarding whether it should be interpreted as deep friendship, romantic love, or something more complex. Modern interpretations vary considerably. The film avoids this debate by portraying Patroclus as Achilles' younger cousin. This adjustment simplifies their relationship for mainstream audiences while preserving its emotional importance. Patroclus still inspires Achilles' grief. His death still motivates the duel with Hector. However, the emotional connection becomes familial rather than open to multiple interpretations. Hector remains one of the adaptation's most faithful characters. Both Homer and the film portray him as honorable, courageous, intelligent, and devoted to family. He consistently places Troy above personal ambition. His relationship with Andromache remains emotionally central. His final duel with Achilles closely resembles the spirit of the Iliad, even when certain details differ. Many readers of Homer consider Hector the emotional heart of the original poem. The film largely preserves this role. One of the reasons Troy continues to attract viewers years after its release is that the film rewards repeated viewing. While it appears on the surface to be a straightforward historical epic, it is filled with subtle visual storytelling, symbolic imagery, references to Greek mythology, foreshadowing, historical inspirations, carefully placed character details, and thematic callbacks that many viewers overlook during their first viewing. Unlike modern franchise films that often rely on obvious Easter eggs referencing sequels or shared universes, Troy hides its details within costumes, dialogue, architecture, camera composition, and character behavior. These hidden elements deepen the story without distracting casual audiences, making the film richer each time it is revisited. One of the earliest examples of foreshadowing appears in Achilles' very first scene. Before fighting Boagrius, Achilles arrives late to the battlefield. Everyone assumes he has abandoned the fight. Instead, he appears calmly, completely confident in his own abilities. This introduction immediately establishes several ideas that continue throughout the film. Achilles lives according to his own rules. He refuses to be rushed by kings. He values reputation over military discipline. Most importantly, he already behaves like someone who believes history belongs to him. This confidence is not simply characterization. It quietly foreshadows both his greatness and his downfall. His certainty becomes one of the defining strengths that make him legendary, while simultaneously preventing him from recognizing how vulnerable he truly is. Another subtle detail occurs during conversations about immortality. Throughout the film, Achilles repeatedly speaks about being remembered forever. At first, these lines sound like expressions of arrogance. However, the audience watching the film thousands of years later already knows he succeeds. His name has survived for over 3 millennia. This creates an unusual form of dramatic irony. The audience knows the ending of Achilles' personal philosophy before he does. Ironically, although he achieves the eternal fame he desires, the film gradually questions whether fame alone provides genuine fulfillment. This makes every conversation about legacy more meaningful during repeat viewings. One of the film's recurring visual motifs involves doors, gates, and entrances. Characters constantly pass through large gates, palace entrances, temple doorways, and city walls. These architectural elements often symbolize important transitions. When Paris and Helen leave Sparta, they cross a threshold separating peace from war. When Achilles enters Troy, he crosses another symbolic boundary from legendary warrior into tragic hero. The famous gates of Troy represent more than military defenses. They symbolize the boundary between civilization and destruction. Once those gates are breached, the world the audience has come to know can never exist again. This repeated use of entrances and exits quietly reinforces the idea that every major decision carries irreversible consequences. The costumes also contain hidden storytelling. Achilles wears relatively simple armor compared to many Greek leaders. Although he is the greatest warrior in the army, his equipment lacks excessive decoration. This reflects his priorities. He values efficiency over appearance. His confidence comes from ability rather than status. Agamemnon, by contrast, wears far more elaborate armor. Decorative details emphasize wealth, authority, and political power. Even before characters speak, their costumes communicate personality. Hector's armor occupies a middle ground. It is practical enough for battle while still reflecting his royal responsibilities. The visual design therefore reinforces each character's worldview without requiring dialogue. Hair and appearance also contribute symbolic meaning. Achilles' long blonde hair creates an almost mythical image, separating him visually from nearly everyone else. His appearance evokes ancient artistic depictions of legendary heroes. Hector's more controlled hairstyle reflects discipline and responsibility. Paris appears younger and less structured, reinforcing his emotional impulsiveness. These visual distinctions subtly support characterization throughout the narrative. One fascinating detail involves the contrast between Achilles and Hector's living spaces. Achilles rarely appears in comfortable domestic environments. Most of his scenes occur inside military camps, battlefields, or temporary shelters. He has devoted his entire life to warfare. He possesses almost no permanent home. Hector, however, frequently appears inside Troy with his wife, child, and parents. His world feels grounded in family and community. Without explicitly stating it, the production design demonstrates what each man truly values. One fights for glory, the other fights for home. The audience gradually realizes that Achilles envies aspects of Hector's life long before he consciously admits it. Briseis functions as another source of subtle symbolism. She frequently wears lighter colors than surrounding characters. In visual storytelling, light-colored clothing often represents hope, compassion, or moral clarity. Whenever Achilles shares scenes with her, the harshness of his personality begins softening. This gradual visual association reinforces his emotional transformation. As the story progresses, Briseis becomes not merely a romantic interest, but a representation of the peaceful life Achilles never believed possible. The temples throughout Troy contain another layer of symbolism. Unlike many historical films, the temples never produce visible miracles. Nevertheless, characters continually pray inside them. This creates an interesting contrast. The audience never sees divine intervention, but faith remains central to the characters' lives. The temples therefore symbolize humanity's search for meaning rather than proof of supernatural power. This reflects the film's broader decision to emphasize human responsibility over divine control. One particularly clever piece of foreshadowing occurs during Hector's farewell to Andromache. Their conversation focuses not only on the coming battle, but also on the future of their son. The dialogue quietly prepares audiences for Troy's eventual destruction. Even if Hector dies, Andromache must survive. The child must survive. Their future becomes more important than Hector's own life. When Troy premiered in 2004, it was far more than just another historical adventure. It was one of the biggest cinematic investments of its time, representing Warner Brothers' attempt to create a modern epic capable of standing alongside classics such as Ben-Hur, Spartacus, and Lawrence of Arabia, while also appealing to contemporary audiences accustomed to large-scale blockbusters like Gladiator and The Lord of the Rings. The production required an enormous financial commitment, years of planning, international cooperation, and one of the largest marketing campaigns of the year. Because of its scale, Troy was never expected to simply become a moderate success. It needed to perform exceptionally well around the world to justify its massive production costs. The film reportedly carried a production budget of approximately $175 million. At the time, this placed it among the most expensive films ever made. To understand how significant that number was in 2004, it is important to remember that most major Hollywood productions still cost well under $100 million. Only the biggest franchises and most ambitious historical epics regularly approached budgets of this size. For Warner Brothers, Troy represented a major financial gamble. Historical epics involve unique expenses that many modern action films do not. The production required enormous outdoor sets. Thousands of costumes had to be designed and manufactured. Hundreds of weapons needed to be created. Large practical locations had to be built. Visual effects teams worked for months creating armies, cities, ships, and battlefields. Thousands of extras appeared during major battle sequences. Large numbers of horses required specialized trainers and handlers. International filming added transportation, accommodation, and logistical expenses. Unlike a modern film largely set inside cities or studios, Troy demanded enormous physical resources before cameras even began rolling. Building the city of Troy alone represented a substantial investment. Rather than relying entirely on computer-generated environments, the production constructed massive practical sets that actors could physically interact with. These included city gates, palace courtyards, temples, defensive walls, military camps, and sections of the Trojan coastline. Although digital effects later expanded these environments, the physical construction remained one of the project's most expensive aspects. Costumes also represented a major financial commitment. Thousands of individually designed outfits had to appear authentic while allowing actors and stunt performers freedom of movement. Armor required multiple versions for different scenes. Weapons needed safe stunt replicas alongside realistic close-up versions. The attention to historical appearance significantly increased production costs. The cast itself also contributed to the overall budget. Brad Pitt was already one of Hollywood's biggest international stars. His involvement immediately elevated the project's commercial potential while also increasing financial investment. Other respected performers, including Bana, Orlando Bloom, Peter O'Toole, Sean Bean, Brian Cox, Brendan Gleeson, Rose Byrne, Diane Kruger, and Saffron Burrows, created an ensemble featuring talent from multiple countries. Although star salaries formed only one part of the budget, casting recognizable international actors strengthened the film's global marketing appeal. Marketing became another enormous expense. Although official advertising budgets are rarely disclosed completely, industry estimates suggest that worldwide promotional campaigns for major blockbusters during this period often approached or exceeded $50 million. Television advertising, magazine coverage, movie posters, international premieres, press tours, television interviews, trailers shown before other major films, large promotional partnerships. All of these required significant financial investment. When production and marketing costs are combined, some analysts estimate that Troy may have required total expenditures exceeding $225 million before ticket sales began recovering expenses. This illustrates why box office performance mattered enormously. Opening weekend performance immediately attracted industry attention. The film debuted strongly in North America, earning over $46 million during its opening weekend. For a historical epic aimed at adult audiences rather than children or teenagers, this represented a healthy start. However, it also reflected the enormous expectations surrounding such an expensive production. Industry observers watched carefully to determine whether audience interest would remain strong over subsequent weeks. Domestically, Troy ultimately earned nearly $133 million across the United States and Canada. Viewed in isolation, this appears impressive. Most films never approach such numbers. However, because of the enormous budget, domestic performance alone would not have covered overall production and marketing costs. This initially led some commentators to describe the North American performance as respectable rather than spectacular. Where Troy truly distinguished itself was internationally. Outside North America, the film became an enormous success. International audiences embraced the story to an even greater extent than American moviegoers. Across Europe, Asia, Australia, Latin America, and many other markets, the film consistently performed extremely well. Its worldwide box office eventually reached approximately $497 million. This international success dramatically changed the financial picture. Nearly three-quarters of the film's global revenue came from markets outside North America. This reflected a growing trend that would become increasingly important during the following decades. Hollywood studios began realizing that worldwide audiences often determined blockbuster profitability more than domestic ticket sales alone. For Troy, international viewers effectively transformed the project from a potentially disappointing investment into a significant commercial success. Europe proved especially important. The story itself occupies a central place within European cultural history. Generations of students have studied the Trojan War through literature, mythology, archaeology, and history classes. Many audiences therefore approach the film with existing familiarity regarding Achilles, Hector, Helen, Paris, and the legendary city. This cultural recognition likely contributed to strong attendance across numerous European countries. Although Troy was initially marketed as a large-scale historical epic, its relationship with audiences did not end when it left theaters in 2004. In many ways, the film's fan community became stronger over time. Unlike movies that generate intense excitement for only a few months before fading from public conversation, Troy gradually developed a loyal international audience that continued discussing its characters, themes, performances, battle sequences, and historical inspirations for years after its release. As internet communities expanded throughout the late 2000s and 2010s, the film found an entirely new generation of fans who discovered it through DVD collections, television broadcasts, Blu-ray editions, streaming services, and online recommendations. One of the most interesting aspects of Troy's fandom is its diversity. The community is not built around a single interest. Instead, it consists of several overlapping groups. Some fans admire the movie primarily as an action epic. Others approach it as a historical drama. Many are interested in Greek mythology. Some became fans because of the cast. Others appreciate the film's emotional storytelling, philosophical themes, or memorable dialogue. This diversity has allowed Troy to maintain relevance across different audiences rather than depending upon one specific fan base. Historical enthusiasts often form one of the largest groups within a community. Many viewers enjoy comparing the film to archaeological discoveries, Bronze Age civilizations, and ancient military tactics. Discussions frequently explore questions such as whether the armor reflects historical evidence, how accurately the city of Troy is portrayed, whether the weapons resemble those used during the late Bronze Age, and how closely the battle formations resemble real ancient warfare. Interestingly, these conversations usually acknowledge that the movie is inspired by mythology rather than functioning as a documentary. Fans often separate historical accuracy from cinematic effectiveness. A scene may be historically questionable while still succeeding dramatically. This distinction has become an important part of many online discussions. Another major section of the fandom consists of mythology enthusiasts. Unlike historians, these fans focus more heavily on Homer's Iliad and other ancient Greek legends. One of the longest-running debates involves the film's decision to remove the gods almost entirely. Some viewers appreciate this grounded interpretation because it places responsibility entirely upon human beings. Others argue that divine intervention represents one of Greek mythology's defining characteristics and should never have been removed. This discussion has continued for years because neither perspective completely dominates. Both sides present thoughtful arguments. As a result, Troy remains a fascinating case study in literary adaptation. Perhaps no topic generates more discussion than Achilles. Brad Pitt's portrayal has become one of the most recognizable versions of the character in modern popular culture. Fans frequently analyze his personality, motivations, philosophy, and emotional transformation. Many discussions examine whether Achilles should be viewed as a hero, an antihero, or a tragic figure. Some admire his relentless pursuit of greatness. Others criticize his arrogance. Many focus on his gradual emotional development through his relationship with Briseis. Because the character contains so many contradictions, conversations rarely reach universal agreement. This complexity helps explain why audiences continue debating him decades later. Hector enjoys equally passionate support. In fact, many fans consider Hector the true hero of the film. Unlike Achilles, Hector never seeks personal glory. He fights because protecting Troy leaves him no alternative. His devotion to family, compassion towards civilians, loyalty to his father, and sense of responsibility resonates strongly with audiences. Online discussions often compare Achilles and Hector not simply as warriors, but as representations of different philosophies. Achilles values individual greatness. Hector values collective responsibility. These debates continue because the film deliberately presents both perspectives sympathetically. Viewers frequently divide according to which worldview they find more compelling. The duel between Achilles and Hector has become one of the film's defining moments within fan culture. Countless online videos analyze every movement of the fight. Martial artists study the choreography. Film enthusiasts examine the cinematography. Editors break down pacing and shot composition. Reaction channels repeatedly feature first-time viewers experiencing the duel. Many fans consider it among the finest sword fights ever filmed because it combines technical excellence with extraordinary emotional weight. Unlike many action scenes remembered only for spectacle, this confrontation succeeds because viewers care deeply about both participants. Quotes from the film have also achieved lasting popularity. Achilles' reflections on mortality, glory, and legacy are frequently shared online. Perhaps the most famous is his observation that the gods envy us because we're mortal. Whether interpreted philosophically or emotionally, the line continues appearing in discussions about life, history, ambition, and human purpose. Other memorable dialogue, particularly exchanges between Achilles and Briseis or Priam and Achilles, regularly appears in video essays, social media posts, and fan edits. These quotations have helped keep the film present in online culture long after its theatrical release. The relationship between Achilles and Briseis generates ongoing discussion as well. Some viewers appreciate the romance because it humanizes Achilles and provides emotional growth. Others argue that the relationship differs too dramatically from ancient mythology. Still others view Briseis less as a romantic character and more as the moral force that challenges Achilles' worldview. Because the screenplay expands her role significantly beyond the Iliad, fans continue debating whether this creative decision strengthened or weakened the adaptation. Another active area of discussion concerns historical accuracy. Many viewers enjoy identifying differences between the movie and archaeological evidence. Armor styles, helmets, architecture, weapons, military formations, naval logistics, timeline compression. Some fans create detailed comparisons illustrating where the film follows history and where it intentionally departs for dramatic reasons. When Troy premiered in 2004, it arrived with enormous expectations. It featured one of Hollywood's biggest stars in Brad Pitt, a celebrated director in Wolfgang Peterson, an immense production budget, breathtaking battle scenes, and source material based on one of the greatest stories ever told. Expectations were extraordinarily high. Critics and audiences alike compared it not only to Homer's Iliad, but also to recent successes like Gladiator and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. While the film achieved impressive box office success, critical reception at the time was noticeably mixed. Some reviewers admired its scale and craftsmanship, while others criticized its historical liberties, emotional restraint, and removal of the gods from Greek mythology. More than 20 years later, however, Troy occupies a very different place in popular culture. Its reputation has steadily improved, and it is now widely regarded as one of the strongest historical epics of the early 21st century. This shift did not happen overnight. Instead, it developed gradually over many years. One of the most interesting aspects of Troy's legacy is that it demonstrates how a film's reputation can evolve long after its theatrical release. Movies are often judged within the context of their own era. Contemporary expectations, current trends, marketing campaigns, critical comparisons, audience hype. These factors strongly influence initial reception. As time passes, however, many of these influences disappear. Future audiences encounter the film without the same expectations. They judge it more on its own merits. This process has benefited Troy enormously. One major reason for the film's reassessment involves changing expectations regarding historical epics. During the early 2000s, audiences had recently experienced Gladiator, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture and redefined interest in ancient historical storytelling. Many critics naturally compared Troy to Gladiator. Because Gladiator focused more heavily on one man's personal revenge story, while Troy explored dozens of important characters across an entire civilization, comparisons sometimes favored the smaller, more intimate narrative. Today, viewers are less concerned with deciding which film is superior. Instead, both movies are appreciated for pursuing different goals. Gladiator examines personal vengeance within imperial Rome. Troy explores competing philosophies of honor, love, leadership, mortality, and legacy across an entire legendary war. Without constant comparison, Troy's own strengths become easier to recognize. Another important factor involves the rise of streaming services. During theatrical release, many people watch a film only once. Streaming fundamentally changed viewing habits. Audiences now revisit older films repeatedly. They pause scenes, study details, watch extended editions, read discussions afterward. This environment strongly favors movies containing thematic depth and visual craftsmanship. Troy rewards repeated viewing exceptionally well. Many viewers who initially remembered only the battle scenes later discovered subtler character development, philosophical dialogue, and symbolic storytelling during subsequent viewings. The director's cut also played a major role in changing public opinion. Many fans believe the extended version presents Wolfgang Petersen's preferred vision more effectively than the theatrical release. Additional scenes strengthen character relationships. Pacing improves. Several emotional moments receive greater development. Some battle sequences become more coherent. The darker tone better matches the tragedy of the story. As increasing numbers of viewers experience the director's cut rather than the original theatrical version, appreciation for the film naturally increased. Many critics who revisited Troy years later specifically acknowledged that the extended edition addressed several earlier concerns. Brad Pitt's performance as Achilles has undergone perhaps the most dramatic reevaluation. Upon release, some reviewers questioned whether he fully captured the legendary hero. Others felt audiences associated him too strongly with contemporary celebrity culture. Over time, however, many viewers began recognizing the subtlety of his performance. Rather than portraying Achilles as an invincible action hero, Pitt gradually reveals insecurity beneath overwhelming confidence. The character begins obsessed with glory, but slowly discovers the emotional emptiness of endless conquest. This transformation becomes more apparent during repeated viewings. Today, many critics consider his Achilles among the defining performances of his career. Bana's portrayal of Hector has received similarly growing admiration. Even viewers who initially preferred Achilles often find themselves sympathizing more strongly with Hector after revisiting the film. His devotion to family, his loyalty to Troy, his reluctance to pursue unnecessary violence, his willingness to sacrifice himself for others. These qualities resonate powerfully with older audiences. Many fans now describe Hector as the emotional center of the entire story. This growing appreciation reflects changing audience priorities. As viewers mature, they often become increasingly interested in responsibility rather than personal glory. Peter O'Toole's performance as King Priam has also become more widely celebrated. His emotional confrontation with Achilles is frequently cited among the finest acting moments in modern historical cinema. The scene demonstrates remarkable restraint. No elaborate special effects. No battle. No spectacle. Simply two extraordinary performances exploring grief, forgiveness, and shared humanity. Many retrospective reviews identify this sequence as the emotional climax of the film rather than any military confrontation. Another reason Troy's reputation has improved involves advances in filmmaking technology. Ironically, newer visual effects have helped older practical filmmaking appear even more impressive. Many modern blockbusters rely heavily upon entirely digital environments. Audiences increasingly appreciate films that combine practical sets, real locations, physical costumes, and restrained computer-generated imagery. Troy represents this transitional period perfectly. Its visual effects remain convincing because computers enhance reality rather than replacing it. The physical sets give actors tangible environments. The battlefields contain real extras. The stunt choreography emphasizes genuine movement.